Boston, 1847. Ships arrived, packed with Irish families fleeing the Great Famine, hungry, desperate, carrying little more than memory. In the crowded neighborhoods and cramped tenement buildings of Boston, food became synonymous with survival. Potatoes, cabbage, salted pork, scraps of fish, simple meals that filled empty stomachs and kept a spark of hope alive. But here's the hidden truth. These very dishes didn't just feed the poor, they forever changed Boston's food culture. From stews and breads to chowders and puddings, the tastes of famine-era Ireland still echo in Boston's kitchens today. New England boiled dinner. Few dishes captured the struggle of the Irish in Boston like this dinner. Imagine a bubbling pot on a tiny stove in a tenement, corned beef sinking to the bottom, cabbage simmering on top, and root vegetables softening in between. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling, and that mattered most. In Ireland, beef was a rare luxury, but at Boston markets, salted brisket was cheap and available. Paired with cabbage and potatoes, vegetables that reminded them of home, this one-pot dinner became a staple. It was practical, too. One pot required less fuel, and leftovers were turned into hash the next day, stretching every penny. What began as survival food for desperate immigrants turned into a lasting tradition. Today, every St. Patrick's Day in Boston, they serve corned beef and cabbage by the plateful, a dish that connects generations to the resilience of their ancestors. Irish stew. If the Boston dinner was an Irish-American invention, then Irish stew was the taste of home carried across the sea. In the cramped kitchens of South Boston, families simmered pots of mutton or cheap beef, potatoes, onions, and carrots until everything melted into a thick, hearty stew. It was the kind of meal that could feed a crowd, warm you to the bone, and remind weary immigrants of what they had left behind. In Ireland, lamb and mutton were traditionally used, but in Boston, those cuts were hard to find or too expensive, so the Irish adapted, often using whatever scraps the butcher couldn't sell. Potatoes and onions were plentiful and cheap. Over time, the stew became less about the meat and more about the comfort it brought. Bacon and cabbage with boiled potatoes. If there was one dish that felt like Sunday dinner for Irish families in Boston, it was bacon and cabbage with boiled potatoes. It wasn't the thick American bacon we know today. It was usually salted pork, boiled until tender, then sliced and served with soft cabbage and a mound of steaming potatoes. Simple, yes, but deeply satisfying. This meal was a direct link to Ireland. For generations, bacon and cabbage had been the centerpiece of Irish farmhouse tables. In Boston, it carried the same meaning: home, family, and a kernel of dignity amid poverty. Boiling everything in one pot kept cooking cheap and efficient, and the leftover broth was used for soups or stews. Nothing went to waste. What began as peasant food became a symbol of heritage.
Salted pork with cabbage and turnips. When money was truly tight, and it almost always was, salted pork with cabbage and turnips fed Irish families in Boston. Pork was the cheapest meat at the docks, sold in barrels, heavily salted to survive the long journey from the Midwest. Immigrants soaked it to remove the excess salt, then boiled it with cabbage and turnips until everything softened into a hearty, salty, sweet stew. It wasn't glamorous. The pork was often fatty or tough, but in cramped tenements it stretched further than fresh meat ever could. Cabbage filled the pot, turnips added bulk, and together they created food that stuck to the ribs. For children who had known hunger during the famine, this dish was pure comfort. Barley soup with onions, carrots, and potatoes.
On cold Boston nights, nothing stretched further than a pot of barley soup. Irish families would toss barley into boiling water with onions, carrots, and potatoes, cheap ingredients that filled the pot and warmed bellies. Meat was optional, and most often there was none. The barley gave body to the broth, turning vegetable scraps into something that felt like real food. In Ireland, barley had long been the grain of the poor. In Boston, it played the same role, affordable, filling, and reliable. Barley soup was not just survival, it was fellowship. Shared among families and neighbors, it proved that even in the hardest times, food had the power to bind people together and keep hope alive. Oatmeal porridge with water or milk? Every Irish family in Boston knew this dish. It was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes the only thing on the table. Oatmeal porridge, made from oats boiled in water, or, if fortune allowed, with a splash of milk. It was plain, it was humble, but it filled the stomach and kept hunger at bay. In Ireland, oats had been a staple for centuries. In Boston, they served the same purpose, but with a new urgency, keeping dock workers, factory hands, and young children from going hungry. A pinch of sugar or a pat of butter were rare luxuries. Most days it was simply a steaming bowl of oats and little else. Irish soda bread with butter. Few smells warmed an Irish immigrant kitchen like the scent of soda bread baking on a hearthstone. Made from flour, baking soda, salt, and buttermilk, it didn't require expensive yeast, just quick hands and a hot pan. In the crowded tenements of Boston, soda bread became a daily staple, sliced thick and spread with butter if the family could afford it. In Ireland, this bread was already tied to survival. In Boston, mothers relied on it the same way, turning meager ingredients into something filling and familiar. For children who had crossed the ocean hungry, a chunk of soda bread meant safety. It meant they wouldn't go to bed starving that night. Boiled salt cod with potatoes and onions. Salt cod was the ocean's gift to poor immigrants. Cheap, preserved, sold by the slab at Boston Harbor, it became a lifeline for Irish families who couldn't afford fresh fish. They would soak it overnight to remove the salt, then boil it with potatoes and onions until everything softened into a hearty, salty stew. This dish echoed Ireland, where saltfish had long been part of the diet for coastal dwellers. In Boston, it became even more common. Salt cod wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It fed families through long winters and reminded the Irish that even in a strange city, the sea still offered a chance at survival. Pan-fried potatoes and onions with fat or cracklins. If there was one dish that showed Irish thrift in Boston, it was fried potatoes and onions. Leftover boiled potatoes were sliced thin, tossed into a hot pan with onions, and fried in whatever fat was available. Sometimes lard, sometimes meat drippings, and on lucky days with crispy bits of bacon. This wasn't just food, it was ingenuity. The smell of sizzling onions filled the cramped tenements, reminding families that even simple food could feel like a feast. In Ireland, potatoes had been life itself. In Boston, they still played that role, but frying gave them a new flavour. These potatoes are just wonderful. Vegetable pottage with peas, turnips, and onions. In the crowded tenements of Boston, a bubbling pot of vegetable pottage was often the only thing standing between hunger and survival. Families would toss together whatever they had: dried peas, turnips, onions, maybe a stray carrot or cabbage leaf, and simmer it into a thick, earthy stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and every spoonful stretched a few pennies further. This dish had deep roots in Ireland. For Irish immigrants, vegetable pottage proved that even the humblest scraps could be turned into comfort. It was the kind of dish that reminded families that even in the hardest times, they could still gather around a warm pot and share hope. Colcannon was the taste of Ireland carried straight into Boston kitchens. Simple yet soulful, it was nothing more than mashed potatoes blended with boiled cabbage, or sometimes kale when cabbage wasn't at hand. A knob of butter on top turned the dish from plain into pure comfort. For Irish immigrants, Colcannon wasn't just food, it was memory. Back home, it was a common peasant dish. In Boston, it reminded families of better days before the famine. Though born of poverty, Colcannon endured as a dish of pride, a reminder that hardship could be softened by tradition.
Boiled ham and root vegetables. For Irish families in Boston who had a little extra money, boiled ham with root vegetables felt like a celebration. A ham hock or shank went into the pot, simmered long and slow until the meat grew tender and the broth became rich. Around it, carrots, parsnips, turnips, and potatoes soaked up the flavor, stretching one piece of meat to feed the whole household. In Ireland, pork was the most familiar meat. In Boston, that tradition continued. Ham was cheaper than beef and more reliable than fresh cuts. It became the centerpiece of Sunday dinners, when families gathered after church, sharing not just food, but a rare sense of celebration.
Boiled oats, or steel-cut oats, with milk or water. If there was one dish that never left the Irish table, whether in Dublin or Boston, it was boiled oats. Steel-cut oats, slowly simmered in water, or on lucky days in milk, filled the morning air with a nutty, hearty aroma. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't fancy, but it gave strength to dock workers, maids, and children heading out into the harsh Boston streets. In Ireland, oats had been survival food for centuries. In Boston, the tradition continued. For the Irish, a steaming bowl of oats wasn't just breakfast, it was endurance in a spoon.
Brown bread with lard or butter. Brown bread was the everyday staple in Irish kitchens in Boston. Dark, dense, made from coarse flour or cornmeal, it was cheap to bake and filled hungry stomachs when there was nothing else on the table. A thick slice spread with lard, or butter if the family could afford it, turned this humble loaf into a full meal. In Ireland, brown bread had been tied to peasant life for generations. In Boston, immigrants kept the tradition alive. Boston brown bread still appears on local tables today, proving that the survival loaves of Irish immigrants baked their way into American history.
Fish chowder. Few dishes connected the Irish to Boston more closely than fish chowder. The harbor was just steps away, and local fish was cheap and plentiful, making it a natural choice for immigrant families. They would simmer chunks of cod or haddock with potatoes and onions in a simple broth, sometimes thickening it with milk if they could afford it. The result was hearty, warming, and easy to stretch for a crowd. In Ireland, fish soups were common along the coast, but Boston gave the Irish access to a whole new abundance of seafood. Chowder became their way of blending old-world habits with new-world resources. Over time, necessity turned into pride.
Corned beef hash. In Irish Boston, nothing went to waste, and that's how corned beef hash was born. After a boiled dinner, families would chop the leftover meat and potatoes, toss them in a skillet with onions, and fry everything until it turned crisp and golden. What had been yesterday's scraps became today's breakfast, hearty enough to fuel labourers through long shifts on the docks or in the mills. This dish was pure practicality. Meat was expensive, potatoes were precious, and stretching food was a matter of survival. Hash turned less into enough. What began as immigrants' way of making ends meet grew into an American staple.
Meat and vegetable hash or stew. For Irish immigrants in Boston, hash often meant whatever scraps could be cooked together. Bits of leftover meat, cabbage leaves, potato chunks, and the occasional carrot. Everything went into one pot. Nothing matched, nothing went to waste, and yet the result was a hearty stew that fed entire families. This kind of cooking was born out of poverty. These stews weren't just food, they were proof of resilience. Every bubbling pot reminded families that no matter how little they had, they could still create warmth, nourishment, and the strength to face another day.
Potato pancakes or griddle cakes. When potatoes were left over, and in Irish kitchens they almost always were, they got a second life as potato pancakes. Known back in Ireland as boxty, these griddle cakes were made by mixing mashed potatoes with flour, maybe an egg if the family had one, and frying them until golden on a hot pan. Crisp on the outside, soft inside, they were cheap, quick, and filling. In Boston's tenements, this dish was pure resourcefulness. Potato pancakes became more than a way to save food, they were a taste of tradition.
Turnip and cabbage stew with a few bits of salted pork was the definition of culinary survival. The pork was never much, often just fatty trimmings or rind, but boiled with cabbage and turnips, it released enough flavor to transform plain vegetables into a hearty, smoky stew. This was peasant food in its purest form. In Ireland, cabbage and turnips had always been fallback crops. In Boston, immigrants relied on them again. The stew filled bellies, kept out the cold, and ensured that no scrap of food ever went to waste. Though it was born of necessity, this stew carried a quiet pride.
Stewed carrots and parsnips with onions. When meat was out of reach, which was often, Irish families in Boston turned to simple vegetable stews. Carrots, parsnips, and onions were cheap, plentiful, and easily cooked down until soft and sweet. Slowly simmered in a pot with just water or a bit of broth, the stew filled the air with warmth and stretched enough to feed the whole household. For many immigrant families, a bowl of this stew was more than food, it was reassurance. It meant the children would go to bed with full bellies, and tomorrow, no matter how hard, they could endure again.
Boiled root vegetables with meat broth. Sometimes the only trace of meat in an Irish immigrant kitchen was the broth left over from boiling pork or beef. Into that precious liquid went carrots, rutabagas, and turnips, cheap root vegetables sold by the cartload at Boston markets. The broth gave them richness, turning plain boiled roots into a hearty, flavorful meal that stretched to feed everyone at the table. This dish reflected the harsh reality of immigrant life. Meat itself was a luxury, but its broth was never wasted. Over time, this simple combination became a kind of comfort food.
Grits or cornmeal mush. Cornmeal wasn't common in Ireland, but in Boston it became a cheap lifesaver. Irish families quickly learned from their New England neighbors that cornmeal mush could stretch a penny further than oats. Made by boiling cornmeal in water until it thickened into a porridge, it was plain, but it filled the stomach and kept hunger away. In tenement kitchens, mothers stirred big pots of mush for breakfast or supper. Irish families soon discovered that cornmeal mush was more than food, it was endurance in a bowl.
Fruit compote with bread or oatcakes. Sweetness was rare in the diet of Irish immigrants, so fruit compote felt almost like a luxury. Families would stew whatever fruit they could find, apples from New England orchards, dried raisins, or the occasional berry, and serve it with coarse oat cakes or slices of brown bread. It wasn't dessert as we think of it today, but it brought color and comfort to tables otherwise filled with cabbage and potatoes. Fruit compote was proof that even in the hardest times, families found ways to create small celebrations. Toasted bread pudding. In Irish kitchens in Boston, nothing went to waste, not even stale bread. Day-old loaves were torn into pieces, soaked in milk, sweetened with a small amount of sugar or molasses, and baked until golden. The result was toasted bread pudding, a dish that turned scraps into comfort. This recipe had deep roots in Ireland. In Boston, it became a favorite way to stretch ingredients. Bread pudding was not just a way to fight hunger, it was a reminder that even in the hardest times, joy could be baked from leftovers.
Bean soup with root vegetables. If there was one dish that stretched further than any other, it was bean soup. Irish families in Boston often bought dried beans or peas in bulk because they were cheap, filling, and could last through the winter. Slowly simmered with carrots, turnips, onions, or potatoes, the beans softened into a thick, hearty broth that could feed a crowd from just a handful of ingredients. In Ireland, peas and beans had been a fallback crop for centuries. In Boston, they played the same role. Each bowl carried the taste of resourcefulness, proof that even the simplest food could keep hope alive.